Every Mortal Kombat game has tried to one-up the last when it comes to brutality, but the entire concept of using the stage itself as a weapon, letting the environment do the killing, that all traces back to a single uppercut in 1992. Today, I'm breaking down how stage fatalities evolved across every major Mortal Kombat game, from a simple pit of spikes to full cinematic executions. And it starts with the moment that changed fighting games forever. Mortal Kombat, August 1992. The original Mortal Kombat hits arcades, and fighting games will never be the same. But here's the thing, it wasn't just the character fatalities that made this game legendary. It was something way simpler than a spine rip or a decapitation. It was an uppercut, the pit stage. You beat your opponent, the screen flashes, finish him, and if you were standing in exactly the right spot and timed your uppercut perfectly, your opponent went flying off the bridge. But the camera didn't just let them fall off screen. It panned down, slowly, and you watched their body land directly onto a bed of steel spikes below. That had never been done before. No fighting game had ever turned the arena itself into the murder weapon. Street Fighter had background characters cheering. Mortal Kombat had background elements killing people. And here's where it gets interesting. Nobody told you how to do it. There was no tutorial, no move list taped to the cabinet. You either stumbled onto it by accident, mashing buttons after a win and watching in shock as your opponent sailed off the edge, or you heard about it from the kid at school who swore he saw someone do it at the mall arcade. That mystery was half the magic. Players would crowd around cabinets trading theories like they were cracking a code. But what makes this moment truly historic isn't the gore. It's the template, that one uppercut, that one camera pan, that one body hitting spikes. It established the entire design philosophy that every Mortal Kombat game after it would either honor, remix, or try to surpass. Every stage fatality you've ever seen is a descendant of the pit. It all started because someone at Midway thought, what if the stage could kill you too? One uppercut invented an entire legacy of environmental kills spanning 3 decades and counting. But if the original pit was the blueprint, Mortal Kombat 2 was where the architects got ambitious. Mortal Kombat 2. Here's the thing about the original pit fatality. It felt like something you stumbled onto, like the developers hid an Easter egg inside a fighting game and hoped somebody would find it. But Mortal Kombat 2 changed that completely, because in 1993, the team at Midway stopped hiding stage fatalities and started building entire arenas around them. The sequel didn't just bring back the pit, it gave multiple stages their own environmental finishers, each one designed from the ground up to kill your opponent in a new and creative way. The pit got an upgrade, but now you also had acid pools, spiked ceilings, and stages where the background wasn't just decoration, it was a weapon waiting to be used. The developers were no longer stumbling into cool ideas. They were engineering them. Every hazard, every ledge, every suspiciously placed set of spikes existed because someone on the design team sat down and asked, how can we murder someone with this room? But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the fact that these stage fatalities were now clearly intentional, the game gave you absolutely zero help figuring them out. No prompts, no visual indicators, no flashing arrows pointing at the death zone. You either knew the inputs and positioning because someone told you, or you didn't. And that created something genuinely special. Stage fatalities in this era became secret knowledge, passed from person to person like contraband at the arcade. The kid who knew how to trigger the Pit 2 fatality was basically a celebrity at your local cabinet. Early internet forums were lighting up with location guides and input lists, but most players were still getting their information the old-fashioned way by watching the guy next to them pull it off and then begging him to explain how he did it. It was social archaeology. You weren't just playing a fighting game, you were participating in a community-wide excavation of hidden content. But Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't just about escalating the violence. The developers also introduced friendships, finishing moves where your character would do something absurdly wholesome instead of ripping someone apart. You could literally offer your opponent a birthday cake instead of sending them into a spike pit. That tonal whiplash, savage brutality one moment and cartoon humor the next, proved the team was already self-aware enough to laugh at their own excess. And that balance between horror and absurdity would become one of the franchise's most enduring signatures. The stage fatality had officially graduated from novelty to design philosophy, but the next game would take that philosophy and crank it to a level nobody expected. Mortal Kombat 3, April 15th, 1995. Mortal Kombat 3 hits arcades, and it brings something that fundamentally changes how the game feels to play: the dial-a-combo system. For the first time, complex button inputs aren't just for special moves. They're baked into the core combat. Long, precise combo strings become the norm, and that complexity bleeds directly into how you execute finishing moves. Stage fatalities got harder, significantly harder. The inputs were more demanding, the timing windows were tighter, and if you weren't already comfortable with the new combo system, pulling off an environmental kill felt almost impossible. This is the moment where stage fatalities stopped being something every player could stumble into and became a badge of technical skill. You either knew the inputs or you didn't. There was no faking it. But here's where it gets interesting, because buried inside all that increased difficulty was the single greatest stage fatality the franchise had produced up to that point: the Bell Tower. You land the correctly timed uppercut and your opponent doesn't just fall. They crash through a wooden floor, then another, then another. Each impact is its own little moment of brutality, the body breaking through layer after layer of timber, picking up speed until they finally land on a bed of spikes at the very bottom. It's not a kill, it's a sequence. It's a story told entirely through falling, and you have to remember this is 1995 arcade hardware, digitized sprites, limited animation frames. The fact that Midway managed to create something that felt like a multi-stage cinematic death scene on that technology is genuinely impressive. Most stage fatalities before this were one beat: uppercut, fall, dead. The Bell Tower gave you 4 or 5 beats of escalating destruction, and each floor hit made the next one feel worse. Players lost their minds over it. People would seek out specific arcade cabinets just to play on the Bell Tower stage and attempt the fatality. It became one of those moments you'd call your friends over to watch. Decades later, it still shows up on practically every best stage fatalities ever list. And honestly, it deserves to be there. The Bell Tower didn't just raise the bar for stage fatalities. It proved that an environmental kill could have pacing, rhythm, and dramatic escalation, all within a few seconds of gameplay. This era was also when the franchise started stress testing just how weird finishing moves could get. MK3 introduced animalities, where your character would literally transform into an animal to deliver the killing blow. They weren't stage fatalities, but they mattered because they showed that Midway was actively pushing the boundaries of what a finishing move could even be. Animals, environments, comedy, brutality. Everything was on the table. The whole philosophy of MK3's finishing moves was cinematic ambition outrunning the technology available to deliver it. The Bell Tower is the perfect example. It wanted to be an action movie death scene, and somehow, on hardware that had no business pulling it off, it succeeded. But if the Bell Tower showed what stage fatalities could accomplish in 2 dimensions, the next game was about to throw the entire formula into uncharted territory. Mortal Kombat 4, September 1997. The entire Mortal Kombat franchise jumped into the 3rd dimension, and stage fatalities had to jump with it. Mortal Kombat 4 was the first game in the series, built entirely with 3D computer graphics, which meant every single environmental kill had to be reinvented from scratch. No more sprite animations, no more predetermined camera angles. Everything was fully rendered, 3-dimensional, and completely uncharted territory for the team at Midway. And here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just a visual upgrade, it was a fundamental design problem. Midway's developers were essentially building one of their first 3D fighting games ever, and the technical hurdles were massive. Rendering characters in a full 3D environment while maintaining the fluid, responsive combat. Mortal Kombat was known for push the team to its limits, but they still committed to making stage fatalities work because cutting them was never really an option. The 2 standout hazard stages were the prison and Goro's lair, both of which supported unique finishing interactions that took advantage of the new spatial dimension. But the real commitment showed in the roster access. Almost every single playable character, Fujin, Jarek, Jax, Kai, Liu Kang, Quan Chi, Raiden, Reiko, Reptile, Scorpion, Shinnok, Sonya, Sub-Zero, and Tanya, could perform stage fatalities in both of those stages. That's not a handful of characters getting special treatment. That's the entire roster. The developers made a deliberate choice to keep environmental kills universally available rather than locking them behind specific fighters, which meant they had to design, animate, and debug stage fatality interactions for 14 characters across 2 stages in a brand new engine they were still learning. But the reception wasn't all celebration. The 3D camera work introduced something the series had never dealt with before: perspective confusion. In the old 2D games, When you uppercutted someone into a pit, you saw it clearly. The impact was immediate and unmistakable. In MK4, the camera would swing around to show the kill from a dynamic angle, which sounds great on paper. In practice, though, the moment of impact sometimes got completely lost in the perspective shift. You'd execute the stage fatality, the camera would rotate, and by the time you figured out what you were looking at, the kill was already over. This created a genuine design tension that's worth understanding. Technical progress and visceral satisfaction don't always move in the same direction. The 3D environments were objectively more impressive, more detailed, more immersive. But the stage fatalities themselves often felt less satisfying than their 2D predecessors precisely because of that added complexity. The simplicity of watching a body fall onto spikes from a fixed side view had a clarity that dynamic 3D cameras struggled to replicate. The community was split right down the middle. Some players loved the new angles and the sense of depth that 3D brought to environmental kills. Others felt like the franchise had traded visual impact for technical ambition, and that the trade wasn't worth it. Both sides had a point. There's one more thing about MK4 that quietly changed everything going forward. This was the last Mortal Kombat to release in arcades as part of the main series. After this, home console development took over completely. That shift didn't just change the business model, it changed how stage fatalities got designed, tested, and discovered. Arcade cabinets meant public play, shared knowledge, and crowd reactions. Home consoles meant private experimentation, online guides, and a completely different relationship between players and hidden content. The 3D leap was awkward, it was messy in places, but it was necessary, because without MK4 proving that stage fatalities could survive a dimensional shift, the franchise wouldn't have had the foundation for what came next. And what came next took the concept of environmental kills and blew it wide open. Mortal Kombat. Deception. So, Deadly Alliance came out in 2002 and just decided stage fatalities didn't exist anymore. No pit, no spikes, no environmental kills of any kind. Zero. And the fanbase noticed immediately, because removing stage fatalities from Mortal Kombat is like removing the ring from a boxing match. You can still fight, but something fundamental is missing. But here's where it gets interesting. When Deception dropped on October 4th, 2004, the developers didn't just bring stage fatalities back. They blew the entire concept apart and rebuilt it from scratch with something called death traps. And these weren't your grandfather's stage fatalities. Traditional stage fatalities had always worked the same way since 1992. You win the fight, you get the finish him prompt, and then you perform the environmental kill as a victory ceremony. Death traps threw that entire rulebook in the garbage. These were environmental hazards built into stages that could kill either fighter at any point during the match. Not after the fight, during it. Think about what that actually means for a second. You're mid-combo, you're winning the round, and your opponent lands one well-placed knockback that sends you into an acid pool. Match over. Doesn't matter that you had a full health bar. Doesn't matter that you were dominating. The stage just ate you alive. Suspended chains, acid pools, mechanical crushing devices, all of them scattered across stages like landmines. Every single environment became a threat assessment puzzle on top of a fighting game. You weren't just tracking your opponent's health bar and move patterns anymore. You were mentally mapping every hazard in the arena and calculating whether that backward dodge was going to save you or send you straight into a death trap. But that's not even the most controversial part. Smart players figured out almost immediately that you could deliberately maneuver opponents toward these hazards. Suddenly, positioning wasn't just about combo range, it was about geography. You could be losing a fight on pure technical skill and still win by backing your opponent into an environmental instant kill. And that created a genuine split in the community. Competitive players pushed back hard. Their argument was simple. Death traps could hand victories to technically inferior players who got lucky with positioning or who relied on stage gimmicks instead of actual fighting ability. The debate boiled down to a philosophical question that the franchise had never really had to answer before. Should a stage be a gameplay mechanic that actively participates in the fight, or should it be a victory ceremony that rewards the winner with a spectacular finish? Deception chose the first option, and not everyone was happy about it. But here's the thing. The developers clearly believed in death traps, because when they ported Deception to PSP as Mortal Kombat Unchained on November 13th, 2006, the death trap system came with it completely intact. They didn't scale it back. They didn't simplify it. They made it portable. You could now accidentally die to an acid pool on a handheld console during your morning commute. That's commitment to a design philosophy. Whether you loved them or hated them, death traps represented the single biggest conceptual shift in stage fatality history. For over a decade, environmental kills had been post-match celebrations. Deception turned them into weapons that could fire at any moment, making stages more dangerous than they'd ever been. It was simultaneously an apology for Deadly Alliance stripping them out and an overcorrection that made the old-school uppercut into the pit look downright polite by comparison. But if Deception rewrote the rules for how stage fatalities work, the next game was about to test just how far those rules could stretch. Mortal Kombat Armageddon, October 9th, 2006. The final Mortal Kombat on 6th-gen consoles, and the developers decided to go out swinging by cramming nearly every single character from the franchise's history onto one roster. We're talking a massive greatest hits collection of fighters, all thrown into one game, and with a sandbox that big, the stage fatality possibilities should have been endless. Armageddon kept the death trap system from Deception and expanded it, adding more hazard-equipped stages while also holding on to traditional stage fatalities. By this point, environmental kills existed on a full spectrum. You had mid-match instant death traps that could end a round in seconds, and you had the classic post-victory ceremony finishers that played out after the finish him prompt. The game wanted to give you both, and on paper, that sounds like the best of both worlds. But here's where it gets funny. The Bell Tower came back, one of the most beloved stage fatalities in the entire franchise, the one that had players losing their minds in Mortal Kombat 3, returned for what should have been a triumphant encore. Instead, it became a community headache. Players could not figure out how to trigger the fatality because the required positioning involved finding a specific red spot on the stage that was nearly impossible to identify. You'd knock your opponent around, try to line them up, and nothing would happen. Forum threads popped up with people flat out admitting they had never once successfully pulled it off. The most iconic stage fatality in the series, and nobody could do it. The community split right down the middle on this. One side argued it rewarded mastery, that figuring out the exact positioning was part of the challenge and separated dedicated players from casual ones. The other side said it was just bad design, plain and simple. When your most famous stage fatality requires a guide, a magnifying glass, and a prayer to execute, something has gone wrong. And honestly, both sides had a point, which is exactly why the debate never really got resolved. But the Bell Tower drama aside, Armageddon had something going for it that the previous 3D games didn't. Narrative weight. This wasn't just another tournament or another realm invasion. The entire storyline was building toward an apocalyptic war where every fighter in the franchise converged for one final battle. The world was literally crumbling around these characters. So when stage hazards killed someone mid-fight, it didn't feel random. It felt like the universe itself was falling apart. The death traps carried genuine thematic purpose for the first time, turning environmental kills into storytelling moments rather than just mechanical gimmicks. And that's what makes Armageddon such a weird, fascinating capstone to the 3D era. The sheer scale was genuinely impressive. Every character, expanded stage hazards, a narrative that justified the chaos. But the execution inconsistencies told a different story. When your flagship stage fatality is borderline broken, and players are arguing about whether it's genius or garbage, the formula is showing its age. The 3D era had pushed stage fatalities further than anyone thought possible back in 1992. But it had also hit a ceiling. The ambition was outpacing the design precision needed to make everything work consistently. The cracks were real, and NetherRealm knew it, because what came next wasn't another sequel. It was a complete reset that would redefine stage fatalities from the ground up. Mortal Kombat, 2011. When the pit came back in 2011, it wasn't just a stage, it was a statement. NetherRealm Studios rebuilt it from the ground up with updated spike geometry, dynamic camera angles, and bone-crunching audio design that made the original 1992 version look like a crayon drawing. And that was entirely the point. This was the studio telling every single fan, we know exactly where we came from, and we're about to show you how far we've gone. But here's the thing. The pit returning was just the symbol. The real revolution was everything happening underneath the surface of this game. Mortal Kombat 2011, released April 19th, 2011, wasn't a sequel. It was a complete narrative reboot that retold the events of the first 3 games from scratch. NetherRealm didn't just reset the story, they overhauled every visual and mechanical system in the franchise. And the single biggest addition was the X-ray move system, which let you watch bones shatter and organs rupture in slow motion mid-fight. That system set the visual bar for the entire game. Every fatality, every brutality, Every finishing sequence had to meet that standard. So, stage fatalities couldn't just be a character falling off a ledge anymore. They had to be cinematic, and that's exactly what they became. Stage fatalities in the 2011 reboot were fully choreographed mini-sequences with deliberate camera work, impact timing, and environmental destruction that made each one feel like a directed scene rather than a triggered animation. The developers treated them as marquee features worthy of promotional trailers, not hidden extras buried in move lists. You weren't just knocking someone into spikes, you were watching the game direct their death like a short film. But here's where the context shift matters. The original arcade games thrived on discovery culture. You found stage fatalities by accident, shared them through word of mouth at the cabinet, and felt like you'd uncovered a secret. By 2011, that world was gone. YouTube tutorials existed. Gaming wikis cataloged every input within days of release. NetherRealm knew this, and instead of fighting it, they designed around it. Stage fatalities were built to be found, performed, recorded, and shared online. They were social currency for the internet age, not hidden rewards for arcade veterans, and the results proved the approach worked. Players uploaded stage fatality compilations that racked up millions of views. The visual quality was so high that these clips functioned as free advertising for the game. Every shared video was essentially a trailer that NetherRealm didn't have to pay for. The Complete Edition, which launched in February 2012 for consoles and July 2013 for PC, extended the game's reach even further. By the time that version hit shelves, the refined stage fatality implementations had been tested, celebrated, and confirmed as the new baseline. This wasn't an experiment anymore. This was the standard. What made the 2011 reboot feel so significant wasn't just the technical upgrade, it was the emotional weight behind it. After years of 3D era inconsistency, after Deadly Alliance stripped stage fatalities out entirely, after Deception turned them into death traps that could end matches randomly, after Armageddon struggled with execution clarity, this game finally made stage fatalities feel important again. They felt intentional. They felt earned. They felt like the developers sat down and asked themselves what made these finishers special in the first place, then rebuilt them with modern tools and modern understanding. The pit spikes gleamed in high definition. The camera swooped down to follow the body. The audio design made you wince. And for the first time in over a decade, a stage fatality in Mortal Kombat felt like it belonged on a highlight reel instead of a troubleshooting forum. But if the 2011 reboot proved that stage fatalities could be cinematic spectacles again, the next entry was about to test whether they could evolve even further. Mortal Kombat 10, NetherRealm. Studios understood something in 2015 that most developers never figure out. The less you give players something, the more they lose their minds when they finally get it. Mortal Kombat X dropped on April 14th, 2015 for PC, PS4, and Xbox One. And it took a completely different approach to stage fatalities than anything the series had done before. Instead of making them freely available from the jump, the game buried them behind a discovery system that forced players to earn every single one. You had to perform a stage fatality at least once before it would permanently appear in your move list. Before that, you were flying blind. And here's where it gets interesting. The game tied each stage fatality to specific trigger points within the environment. You couldn't just win a match and input a universal command. You had to know exactly where to stand, which stage you were on, and what button sequence that particular stage required. Every stage had its own unique directional input tied to a specific face button, and the combination shifted depending on which environment you were fighting in. Every environment had its own rules, its own hotspot, its own rhythm. This created something beautiful. The Mortal Kombat community went absolutely feral trying to document everything. Dedicated Reddit threads popped up within days of launch, with players mapping out every stage fatality location, sharing input sequences, and tracking which stages had been confirmed. Video guides flooded YouTube. Completion trackers became a thing. It turned stage fatalities into a community-wide scavenger hunt, and the friction of having to discover them first made every successful execution feel like you'd actually accomplished something. But the real genius was in the scarcity. Mortal Kombat EX deliberately kept stage fatalities rare compared to character fatalities. Not every stage had one. Not every environment rewarded you for looking. And that restraint is exactly what preserved their power. Think about it. If every single stage has a fatality, they become routine. You stop reacting to them. They become background noise. But when stage fatalities are limited, when you only see them on specific stages under specific conditions, they become events. This paid off massively in tournament settings. When a player landed a stage fatality during a competitive match, the crowd reaction was genuinely unhinged. People jumping out of their seats, commentators screaming, the whole venue erupting. That kind of moment only happens because stage fatalities were scarce enough to feel special. If they were everywhere, nobody would flinch. NetherRealm weaponized rarity, and it worked perfectly. But here's the part that shows just how deeply stage fatalities had embedded themselves into the Mortal Kombat identity. Players didn't just appreciate the stage fatalities that existed, they actively speculated about the ones that didn't. Community forums were filled with discussions about hypothetical stage fatalities for environments that shipped without any environmental finisher, because not every stage made the cut. Players weren't asking, should these stages have fatalities? They were asking, why don't they? The assumption had completely flipped. Stage fatalities weren't a bonus feature anymore. They were an expectation. An environment without one felt incomplete. That shift in player mentality is the real legacy of Mortal Kombat X's approach. The unlock system, the location-specific inputs, the limited availability, all of it worked together to make stage fatalities feel precious again. Not throwaway animations you trigger after every win, but genuine spectacle moments that rewarded knowledge, positioning, and the patience to figure them out. NetherRealm proved that sometimes the smartest design choice isn't giving players more, it's giving them less, and making every piece of what you do give them feel like it matters. But if you think MKX's restraint was the final word on how stage fatalities should work, Mortal Kombat 11 had a very different opinion. Mortal Kombat 11, announced at the Game Awards 2018 and released on April 23, 2019, Mortal Kombat 11 laid the groundwork, but it was the Aftermath expansion, released on May 26, 2020, that put stage fatalities back on a pedestal. NetherRealm treated the return of stage fatalities as a genuine selling point, marketing them alongside the surprise comeback of friendships, a finishing move nobody had seen since Mortal Kombat Trilogy back in 1996. That's a 24-year gap, and the community lost its mind. Forums lit up, social media exploded, and suddenly everyone was talking about environmental kills, like they were a brand new invention rather than a mechanic that had been around since the original pit. But here's where it gets interesting. The visual leap between MKX and MK11 wasn't incremental. It was generational. The game's advanced graphics engine transformed stage fatalities from cool finishing moves into fully interactive cinematic sequences, each one meticulously tailored to the aesthetic and thematic identity of its specific stage. Every environment felt like it was authored to kill you. The architecture, the hazards, the camera angles, all of it designed with your opponent's destruction in mind. These weren't just arenas you happened to fight in, they were execution chambers waiting for you to pull the trigger, and the interactivity went deeper than any previous entry. Multiple trigger points per stage gave players genuine options within the stage fatality system. You weren't locked into a single scripted kill anymore. You could choose how the environment destroyed your opponent, which meant that the same stage could produce different spectacular deaths depending on where you positioned the final blow. That layered interactivity is the direct descendant of every design decision stretching all the way back to 1992's Pit Uppercut. One mechanic, refined across 27 years, finally reaching its full potential. But the real genius of MK11's finishing move system wasn't just the stage fatalities themselves, it was the choice they created. Every single time the screen flashed finish him, you had a decision to make. You could trigger a brutal, cinematic environmental execution where the stage itself tears your opponent apart in ways that would make a horror director uncomfortable. Or you could send them a birthday cake. That's friendships. Wholesome, absurd, deliberately ridiculous finishing moves sitting right next to the most graphically violent environmental kills the franchise had ever produced. And that contrast is peak Mortal Kombat identity. The series has always understood that extreme violence works best when it's self-aware, when there's a wink behind the blood. Bringing back friendships alongside the most advanced stage fatalities ever created was a full circle moment that connected MK11 directly to MK2's original tonal DNA. Brutality and comedy, existing in the same breath, letting the player decide which version of Mortal Kombat they wanted to be in that moment. The evolution didn't stop at launch either. Mortal Kombat 11 Ultimate, released on November 17, 2020 for Switch, PS4, PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X/S, expanded the stage fatality roster even further. Post-launch content additions kept rolling out new environmental kills, which meant that stage fatalities had officially graduated from a launch feature to living, evolving content. They weren't a checkbox on a feature list anymore. They were a system that grew with the game, something NetherRealm actively invested in months and years after release. That shift matters more than it sounds. For decades, stage fatalities were static. You got what shipped on the disc, and that was it. MK11 changed that relationship entirely. Stage fatalities became something the community could anticipate, speculate about, and celebrate when new ones dropped. They became events. Now step back and look at the full arc. In 1992, a single uppercut knocked a pixelated sprite off a bridge and onto a row of spikes at the bottom of the pit. The animation was simple. The camera pan was basic. The entire sequence lasted maybe 3 seconds, and it changed fighting games forever. From that one moment, stage fatalities survived the jump to 3D in MK4. They were controversially removed in Deadly Alliance, then reinvented as Death Traps and Deception. They weathered the chaos of Armageddon's massive roster, got rebuilt from the ground up in the 2011 reboot, and were refined into interactive environmental systems in MKX. Each generation tested them. Each transition threatened to leave them behind. And every single time, they came back. Stronger, more creative, more deeply woven into the fabric of what Mortal Kombat actually is. By the time MK11 delivered fully rendered cinematic environmental executions with multiple trigger points and player choice built into every stage, the mechanic had crossed 3 console generations, 1 complete franchise reboot, a controversial absence, and the entire transition from 2D sprites to photorealistic 3D. That's not just good game design, that's franchise DNA. The pit uppercut didn't just start a mechanic in 1992, it started a tradition. And 27 years later, that tradition has never been stronger. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.